Hello and welcome. Today is the first of a series of webinars focused on the transition of students with disabilities. This project is funded by the U.S. Department of Education Rehabilitative Services Administration. We would like to thank our partners, Virginia Commonwealth University Research Rehabilitation Training Center. Today's program comes to you from PEATC, the Parent Educational Advocacy Training Center. PEATC is Virginia's PTI, Parent Training and Information Center, and it is also the state PIRC, Parent Information and Resource Center. We have, for the last 30 years, been encouraging and helping families to get involved and stay involved with their children's education. And today, as I mentioned, is the first of a series of webinars focused on students with disabilities. If you are a transition professional or a parent, we would like to offer you some benefits for participating in this series. If you're a professional seeking CEC or CRC credits, please contact Terry Blankenship at VCU. And if you're a parent or a self-advocate and would like a PEATC certification, please contact Katherine Wittek at PEATC. Participants are requested to view all 3 webcasts and to engage in field work, which is also available at the PEATC website, www.peatc.org. At the end of this webcast, we invite you to post questions on our web board, and you can find that link on your screen now. Today's webcast is entitled Laying the Groundwork for Secondary Transition. And the reason that we selected this title and this subject is that we often find families who are facing transition are quite fretful and have a lot of questions and a lot of anxiety about facing the future for their students with disabilities. So today what we hope that you will get out of this is that you're going to have some really basic information and understanding of transition planning, and that you will actually learn how to develop that transition IEP. So what's different about secondary school transition? You know, as a family member, when our children transition from early intervention into primary school, and then from elementary school into middle school, and then into high school, we know about transitions. Transitions are pretty complex. They're pretty complicated. And for families with a person with a disability, we need to play a balancing act at all times. So when we talk about transition, it invokes a fear for families. But now that we're talking about leaving the protected environment that our K-12 education system has provided, suddenly we are having to face questions that sometimes don't have very easy answers. And so today we want to start getting information out to people about how to prepare for transition and how to actually live through it and walk through it with your student. In IDEA 2004, there were some changes made to the transition amendments. Actually, they were very, very helpful because we have a new shift. We are looking at a system that is results-oriented, and there is a focus on improving those results. And this was part of the alignment with the NCLB, where we were looking at adequately yearly progress, and where all students were encouraged to learn, and schools were encouraged to identify the support that students needed. So in secondary transition, who are the partners that parents need to know about? And we find that certainly school professionals continue to be our partners, teachers, special ed teachers, perhaps a guidance counselor in the school psychologist, but there are other organizations and other individuals who we might also pull into the process to be part of our team. There are adult community agencies, adult service providers, and later on in this series we will learn about who some of those partners are from the adult service world. There are also family and community personal networks that we might have. Perhaps it's a neighbor who has a small company who would be interested in employing your son or daughter. And then finally, employers potentially are partners in our transition team. We would like to refresh your memory. You know, one of the cornerstones of PEATC is about partnership development. We truly believe that in order to serve children with disabilities well, the adults need to partner together. They need to work together. You know, and a partnership, once again, is a relationship between two people, each having equal status and independence, but having some obligation to each other. And in our experience, in our 30 years of working with families, we have found that we can see really successful outcomes in those areas when families and professionals work together to support the child. So what's different about this secondary transition that we may not have thought about? Well, it is your son or daughter. They must be one of the drivers of this process. They must be involved. It is about them. It is about their likes, their needs, their strengths, and where they would like to go and what they'd like to do after high school. And the reason that we focus on transition is there have been a number of studies, a number of national research studies that tell us some pretty startling news. The National Council on Disabilities in 2000 released a report that showed an overwhelming number of youth with disabilities are undereducated and underqualified for today's job market. They're also unemployed and many times unprepared for the rigors of post-secondary education. A recent census report in 2000 demonstrated that only 56% of people with disabilities actually are employed versus 88% of the general population. We also find that youth with disabilities are less likely to start post-secondary education than their peers without disabilities. 27% of students with disabilities transition to post-secondary education compared to 68% of their peers without disabilities. We also find young adults with disabilities in post-secondary education are less likely to persevere and complete a degree or a certificate than are their peers without disabilities. And for those students with disabilities who do finish post-secondary education, they often take twice as long to complete their degrees than do their non-disabled peers. So there's a real need for us to focus and pay attention to our transitioning students with disabilities. We also have federal law now that actually is in support of our children, our sons and daughters with disabilities. Congress finds that disability is a natural part of the human experience and in no way diminishes the right of individuals to participate in or contribute to society. That means we, Congress, expects them to live independently, enjoy self-determination, make choices, pursue meaningful careers, and overall enjoy full inclusion and integration into the economic, political, social, cultural mainstream of American society. So we have clear, convincing information for why we need to really focus on the transition of our students with disabilities. But where do we begin? Because once again, for parents and families, it's a pretty daunting prospect to have to look into the future, because none of us has a crystal ball. Some of us have dreams, others are afraid to dream. So where can we begin? Well, we say let's take it a step at a time here. First of all, let's be sure we understand about partnership development. Let's remember that partnership is about equality, equal in value and status. Partners require sharing knowledge for the good of the child, and independence in regard to each partner's bringing viewpoints and contributions for cooperative decision making. Partners are also obligated to one another. to work together to solve problems. You know, not every partnership is an easy partnership, not an easy relationship. It takes a lot of care, a lot of nurturing. It doesn't happen naturally, but the benefits are untold. And in fact, the very partnerships that we model for our children perhaps are the ones that will help our children navigate through this complex adult life. We'd also like families, certainly, to be informed. Be informed about what the secondary transition IEP must include. It does require a statement of appropriate measurable post-secondary goals based upon age-appropriate transition assessments. We're going to learn about those today. And it also requires that not, at least beginning, not later than the first IEP to be in effect when the child turns 16, that's when we begin transition planning. We also believe that families and students with disabilities should dare to dream. There is so much happening in the world of disability beyond what our expectations were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, even 5 years ago. So transition planning is based on the age-appropriate assessments and considers the student's strengths, the student's interests, the student's preferences. So you see, we have to have that student involved, and we have to have that student understanding about dreaming in training, education, employment, and when it's appropriate, independent living skills. And for the adults on the team, we encourage you to know just how important you are to the process. Adults must lead the way for students to develop self-advocacy skills so that they may have a self-determined future. So, we asked a panel of experts, what were the top 10 things we should tell transition team members to think about as they set forth in developing transition plans? And so these are the top 10 things that our panel of experts have told us. They recommend that people start early, begin in middle school at least, and for families, certainly, you're going to begin when you are even listening to the words that your child has a deficit and needs some support. Use a common language. You know, it used to be that the transition plan was a separate document. It isn't now. It is the IEP. Ask questions and then ask again. Don't be afraid to ask. If you don't understand something, keep asking and encourage your son or daughter to ask as well. Make sure you understand the difference between entitlement versus eligibility. Under IDEA services, students are entitled to a free, appropriate public education. In the adult world, they may be found eligible for services from some of our community and adult agencies, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the services will be available to them. So be sure that you understand about entitlement and eligibility. Find out what exists and what doesn't exist. There are lots of urban legends out there about what kinds of services don't exist for students, but doing a little digging, you might find that, in fact, there are lots of opportunities for your student. Is transition a time of crisis, or is it a time of opportunity? And this is really for families. If you think that that transition is the end of the world for you, well, then it's going to feel like the end of the world. But if you can think of it as a time for learning new things and exploring new things and really seeing this young person grow and blossom into a wonderful adult, you're going to have a wonderful time during transition. We also recommend, this panel of experts recommends that you look at what has worked and what hasn't worked in your own child's life. You know what kind of environment they're comfortable in. You know what the stressor buttons are. So keep that in mind as you plod forward in transition. Redefine the concept of seamless transitions. You know, even for our sons and daughters who are typically developing and who graduate from high school and go on to a job or go on to college, they have setbacks. And not everything works as we had originally thought. So think it through that there maybe really isn't a seamless transition for anybody in this life. And then the final two are really for families in concert with professionals. One, we want to say, you know, this family really is an asset. Families have personal networks. They have rich resources that they can share with professionals. They really can help their students to find interesting careers. They can take them to museums. So please view family as a part of the solution and not a part of a problem. And the final thing is that we'd love for professionals to hear, and that is that students are not the only ones in transition. This is a very stressful time for parents, and they may sometimes indicate and communicate and articulate their stress in negative ways, but please support us too. We still need your support. We are going to cover a case study today, and I just want to briefly go over that for those of you who were unable to download it earlier. Johnny is a 9th grade student with mild learning disabilities and other health impairments. He's accessing the general education curriculum with the goal of achieving a standard or modified diploma. He enjoys music, but his parents really don't know where to begin transition planning. And next up, we are going to meet Cathy Wittek. Cathy is with the Virginia Department of Education TEATC, Technical Assistance Online, funded by the Virginia Department of Education, and she is housed here at Virginia Commonwealth University. If you have questions, please pose them on our web board at the conclusion of this webinar. And if you would also like other information, please call PEATC at 1-800-869-6782. Once again, for Virginia parents, 1-800-869-6782. And now I would like to introduce Katherine Wittek of Virginia Commonwealth University TEATC. Thank you.
Thank you, Cathy. Today we're going to talk about how you get started with the transition planning process. The first step in transition planning is to start with age-appropriate transition assessments. And this is important for every single student. Every student of transition age should participate in an age-appropriate transition assessment through middle and high school. From that information, one would take the student's goals and interests and preferences and develop measurable post-secondary goals. Measurable post-secondary goals refer to life after high school. And from that, you would build transition services, which is also called the coordinated set of services. This chart shows you the whole process. You take the results of age-appropriate transition assessments, help the student to develop his or her measurable post-secondary goals, and the student is describing life after high school. Using that information, the teacher and the transition team will build a present level of educational performance, always referencing the student's strengths, interests, and preferences, then build annual goals and the student's needed accommodations within the IEP. As you're working on this, you build transition services, or the coordinated set of services that the student must use. And at this point, you're also talking about linkages to agencies. You're trying to find the people that will help the student to attain his or her post-secondary goals. And when this is all in place, the student will acquire and reach his or her desired post-school outcomes. Sounds simple. Let's see how this works. Assessment, transition assessment, is a process of compiling information. It's no different than having the student participate in the SOL, the VAP, or any of those assessments. But the difference with the transition assessment is that you're using interest inventories. You're using various tools to help guide the student to describe what he or she wants to do after high school. And this is the starting point. Start there. There is no way a student can identify post-secondary goals without participating in age-appropriate transition assessments. And the development of post-secondary goals doesn't occur in isolation. The student's voice is a very integral part of this. It's always important to remember that transition is a process. It's not a one-day event. And the process identifies the skills and knowledge that the student will use for life after high school. And this comes right from the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 2004. And that law stated that the student has to have all of these pieces and parts in order to make a successful transition to adult life. You're talking about the skills that the student currently has, but you're also discussing what the student needs in order to get to life after high school. And this was taken from a textbook written by Dr. Carol Kochar Bryant, written in 2007. So you may be asking yourself, how? When? How can I do this? My advice for parents and students and teachers is to start early. Always keep your eye on that prize of graduating and then proceeding into life after high school. So always look at what skills the student has and what skills the student will need in order to attain the post-secondary goals that the student will eventually describe. For example, in middle school, you might start using some inventories, some interest inventories. You might measure aptitudes, and you can certainly tell what a student's preferences are. Let me give you an example. For a student in middle school to sit down and state, yes, I am definitely going to be a dentist. And this is based on what? Well, after an interest inventory, you may find that the student has strong skills in science, has a strong interest in teeth, has had some experience helping in an uncle's dentist office, has the aptitude to do this, and the student may have his eye on a certain college in order to become a dentist. Or if a student has an interest in becoming an animal groomer, and you can see from an early age that the child has a strong interest in working with animals and has an affinity for this field. The student might not end up with exactly that goal, but you can tell what the interests and preferences are. And it's always helpful to document every step along the way. The Commonwealth of Virginia has purchased the rights to a pretty easy assessment to use. It's called the Cooter. And here is a web resource for you. You can go online and look at this. It's www.cooter.com, or you can go to Virginia View at Virginia Tech. And again, these are free. And there are lesson plans for teachers to use with students so that you can build an interest in life after high school. The guidance office in your middle school or high school should have knowledge of this. As you're working on transition assessments, you're looking at 5 main areas. You're looking at education, how the student is doing in school, what the student's learning style is. You're looking at the student's career skills and abilities. And you always have to look at, as you're looking at that area, what can the student lift? How long can the student sustain a certain task? What are the student's motor skills? You measure them through the transition assessments. You have to look at the student's independence. Is this student always on time for class? Does the student maintain his or her own schedule? In terms of health care, does the student take his medication independently? Does the student always wait for mom, dad, teacher to always remind him or her to complete a task? And transportation. Many students in high school might always look at driver's ed as the best class in high school. Well, transportation is an important part of independence, and that is something that can be woven into a student's IEP. Perhaps a student might need some accommodations in the driver's ed class, and you can measure that as part of a transition assessment. The fourth area to look at are emotional and social skills. Will the student get along with the team? Many times in work sites or in employment, in your job, you have to get along with a lot of people. Is the student a loner? That doesn't mean that the student can't be employed. But how does the student handle frustration? Is the student able to manage his mental health? Are there supports in school? How do you build those supports? And the fifth, but this is not last but least, this is one of the most important skills to measure, is self-determination. Does your student know her disability? Is she able to say, I have a learning disability. I'll need a scribe in this class. I need someone to take notes for me. I need to sit up front because I'm distracted by other people. A goal for all students is to be able to do every one of these things. And you can build the school program through the IEP around these 5 areas. So remember, the key is transition assessment isn't just about work. It's about the whole student. After you've completed the transition assessments with parental input, with family input, with the student's voice driving the process, you assist the student to develop post-secondary goals. And as I said before, you're talking about life after high school. You talk about what the student wants to do in the context of independent living, education, and employment. And you incorporate the transition assessment information into the present level of performance. For many years, educators worked on IEPs and started with the present level of performance. He reads on a 5th grade level. He has mathematics skills on perhaps an 8th grade level, and on and on and on. And that information is very, very important. But what's most important is, what does this student want to do after high school? And how will we help him to get there? So you develop the present level of performance, looking at academic achievement and functional performance. And in the Virginia Code, it reads that the present level of performance has to directly relate to other sections of the IEP. So transition is no longer separate. For many years, we referenced the transition section of the IEP as the transition plan. And we're not doing that anymore. At the secondary level, transition is the IEP. And that's a philosophical shift supported by the law. So where would the transition data be captured in the present level? And how does that fit into the development of the present level of performance? Remember, we talked about the interests and preferences of the student. You have to capture that through the transition assessment. You talk about the student's achievement. How is she doing compared with her other classmates? But how is she doing in terms of what she wants to do after high school? What is her learning style? Is she a visual learner? Then you have to capture that. Which learning strategies work best with her? Are you finding that it's really helpful for you to have her work in a team with a group of people to verbally respond? Use those strategies, mention them. Talk about the student's adaptive behavior. Is this student needing some assistance with organizational skills? Do you think that that issue will carry over into life after high school? How would this student's needs affect his or her employment? Always keep your eye on what will happen after high school and then build the resources into the IEP. You also discuss the student's behavior and social skills, work readiness, and sometimes you talk about work samples. For example, in a present level of performance, you might indicate that a student on a certain day had been on a job site and had completed every task and then had searched out some other tasks to work on. That would show that the student has a lot of initiative. That's important information. You might mention, based on a transition assessment in January 2008, it appears that Johnny, whom we will talk about, has an aptitude for mathematics. He also has a strong aptitude in music. Those things should be captured in the IEP. Sometimes people use situational assessments as part of a transition assessment. And what this means is a student might be taken to a job site or within the context of a school placement and given a series of activities to work on, and the student is assessed as he or she performs those activities. Usually you're measuring the pace, how the student follows directions, and those kinds of things. And that's, again, it's very important information as you're looking at how the student will work after high school. I've given you a lot of information, but the most important part of the transition IEP is the student's voice. I've been talking about how you, the teacher or the parent, can gather information to assist the student, but you have to make sure that the student is a major part of this process. And his or her voice has to guide what will be meaningful for his future. Let's look at this chart for a minute. If you look down in the bottom left corner, you can see that we're talking about age-appropriate transition assessments, and we talked about how to use them within the context of the IEP. So for step one, using the transition assessments, you develop measurable post-secondary goals. You weave that into step two as you develop the present level of academic achievement and functional performance, always looking at how this relates to training, education, and employment, independent living skills where appropriate. And my personal bias is all students need some assistance and some guidance through the independent living skill phase. There are many students with milder disabilities that still need to be working on things such as managing a debit card, driving appropriately, those kinds of skills. That's all part of independent living. Step three is where you develop the transition services. So you develop a course of study, and you're talking about the instructional services that will support the student to get to where he wants to go after high school. If a student has decided that he wants to go in the Marines, you have to make sure that this student can pass his coursework, can pass the Asvab, which is a test that's administered, and it's a barrier test for students, so that the student will be accepted. You have to make sure that the student has to make sure that he has, actually, the skills that he needs to be accepted by the Marines. This is all part of school. It's not separate. And you look at employment, which would be the military, and other post-school living objectives. And certainly a student's daily living skills would be very important as the student is looking at joining the military, or working at a grocery store, or becoming a teacher, or any one of a myriad of desired post-secondary goals. Then you develop step 4, the measurable annual goals that will support the student to achieve his post-secondary goals. Do you see the change now? You're starting with what the student wants to do after high school. Then you're building in the supports. And it is a process. Many times I'm asked the question, what's the difference between an annual goal and a post-secondary goal? There has been some confusion with this change in the law. Well, annual means exactly that. A measurable annual goal answers this question: what do we want this student to be able to do in a year's time? But for a transition IEP, when you're talking about a measurable post-secondary goal, we want to know, what do we want the student to do this year, in a year, relative to the student's measurable post-secondary goal? Do you see the difference? Let me illustrate this. Measurable post-secondary goals are outcomes. They're the activities and the events that occur after the student has graduated high school, what the student will do. The student will enroll in, attend, complete, or work in a certain setting. Let's talk about Johnny. He's in the 9th grade, he has a mild learning disability, and he has some other health impairments. He's accessing the general ed curriculum, and he's planning to achieve a standard or a modified standard diploma. He loves music, and his parents have absolutely no idea where to begin with transition planning. This is a brand new concept for them and for Johnny. Johnny thinks that he wants to go to college and live in a dorm, but his health conditions are of concern to his parents and those around him. Johnny has a new special ed teacher this year, and this special ed teacher doesn't understand how to develop these post-secondary goals. And at this point, Johnny's present level of performance doesn't contain information about his career interests. So what should we do? Well, the first step is to look at Johnny's transition assessment. And it appears that he enjoys music, has an aptitude for that, but also has some other skills. He likes to cook. And he cooks around 3 times a week for his family. He likes to drive, and he has a part-time job. Here's an example of his employment post-secondary goal. After high school, Johnny will be employed as a chef or a cook. For independent living, after high school, Johnny will independently acquire and take his necessary medications in the manner prescribed by his physicians. Who's going to do this? Johnny. Not mom, not teacher, not nurse. Johnny. You have to begin with the end in mind. Do you remember this chart? Start with the results of transition assessments. Help the student to develop measurable post-secondary goals. Build in a present level of performance that reflects the student's post-secondary goals. Use annual goals and accommodations that support what the student wants to do after high school. And build transition services with the necessary linkages, such as to agencies. Build the course of study and the activities that will support the student to get to where he wants to go. And then the student will reach his desired post-school outcomes. There are 3 guidelines when you develop a present level of performance. You reflect the student's post-secondary goals, such as this. Following high school, Johnny plans to go to culinary school to become a chef. He met with his guidance counselor during his junior year to research options for culinary arts training, as well as the requirements for acceptance. So the school is helping him, but this is Johnny's goal. Summarize the current academic and functional achievement, emphasizing the needs that will impact the realization of those post-secondary goals. If the student has some difficulty with reading, you might discuss some assistive technology that will assist the person. You might discuss agencies that can help the student. In education and training after high school, Johnny will complete a culinary arts training program. That is his goal. Then you document the use of age-appropriate transition assessments to summarize the interests, preferences, strengths, and needs. This is a shift, but it's based on what the student needs after high school. And who might assist with the development of the present level of performance? Two of the key players in this process are the student and the parents and guardians. And they should lead and guide the transition IEP team. Keep this chart in mind as you work on this. And thank you for participating. We look forward to your questions on the web, and I'll be available to assist.